Hi, welcome to In Search of Slow, a podcast exploring realistic ways to slow down in our fast paced world. I'm September.
And I'm Erin.
And today we're discussing how we spend money. So, how does money relate to slow living, and do you need to have a lot of money to slow down?
Your lifestyle is really a result of how you spend money. So, having a good understanding of where your money is going can help you to spend your money in a way that aligns with the kind of lifestyle you want to build for yourself.
I definitely agree with that. So, actually, until recently, I didn't used to keep track of my spending at all, and it was because I had very little money. So, I think what was happening was that I kind of figured that there was no flexibility in how I was spending my money because there was so little of it. And I felt like I wasn't spending money on much besides the essentials anyway. But then once I started to track my spending and really look at how I was spending the money that I did have, I realized that I actually spent a lot of money on things that I really don't care about that much. And realizing that allowed me to take that money that I had been spending on things I don't care about and put it towards things that actually are important to me.
Yeah, for me, money has been a key part of slowing down, but not in the sense of like having a certain amount, but in being very mindful of where and how I'm spending it. So, what's interesting is when some people see me on social media, they often assume that I'm wealthy since my husband and I both work part time. But the way we've managed this is by being very careful and conscious with our money. So, no, I don't think you need to have a lot of money to slow down, but you do have to have a good understanding of where your money is going.
Yeah, I think that that's definitely true. And money is something that is always on people's minds. I think we see this reflected in hustle culture, which has become pretty popular. And I see a lot of online articles and influencers focusing on this idea of working really hard all the time or having all these side hustles to try to make as much money as possible. But this raises a question. Does trying to make as much money as possible actually make you happier? So, something that I think is important to acknowledge before we get into all of this is that for some people, the reality is that 100% of their budget goes towards essentials. And while that's also a really important topic, it's too big for us to cover within this episode. So, just for the sake of this episode in particular, we're specifically talking about when you're in a situation where you have a little bit of wiggle room in your finances and not absolutely everything is going towards just getting by. So, getting into it, I've noticed that people have very different ideas about how much money they actually need to have. I have friends and family members who are pretty happy without spending much money at all. And then I also have some friends who seem to need what feels to me like a lot of money. So, Erin, have you noticed this with your friends and family and the social groups that you're in? And where do you think that you fall within that range?
Yeah, it's actually wild to me how two people with a similar income can have drastically different lifestyles and approaches to money. I would say on the spectrum of it, I fall more on the frugal side, but I also really believe in investing money where it counts and trying to support businesses that reflect my values. I think you really have to kind of build a lifestyle that matches what you can afford instead of trying to constantly reach this like aspirational lifestyle that always requires more money. So, like I mentioned, I occasionally get comments from people on social media where they clearly think I'm way more wealthy than I am. But the reality is that my family actually lives on like less than or around the average household income here. Both my husband and I work part time and we watch our child. And we've made a lot of decisions, and we've been able to do this by really figuring out our priorities and what we're willing to sacrifice or let go of to be able to have a certain lifestyle within our financial means. So, for example, we live in a multi generational house to save on housing costs. So, this is obviously not for everyone, but you can get creative with ways to afford the life you want. I think one of the key things is to try and separate what you actually want instead of what society tells us we want or the lifestyle that we need to have.
Yeah, I think that that's a great point and that it's a big one for a lot of people. I think that for a lot of us, it can be very difficult to tell what it is that we actually deeply care about versus what am I going to feel bad about if other people are judging me for not having that thing, but, maybe I don't personally actually care about that thing very much. And I also think that it's a great point when you talked about figuring out what are your priorities, because those are different for everybody. I have one friend in particular, who I talk to a lot about money because he's really, really into budgeting and being extremely frugal. And I think that his lifestyle, he and his partner have a particular lifestyle that I think for a lot of people would seem very extreme, but they really enjoy it. And for me, I think that I fall somewhere closer towards that end of things than a lot of people that I know, but I definitely am not quite as frugal as my friend is. So I do enjoy sometimes going out for dinner or things like that. So it is a personal decision, but I think the important thing is to, you know, figure out where you fall along that spectrum.
Yeah, figuring out your priorities is huge. Like, for example, when I had my child, one thing that we discussed was that we both really, especially in her, first like 5 years before she's in school, we both really wanted to be able to spend a lot of time with her. And so figuring out a way that we could structure, work, finances, all of that around prioritizing time in those early years was something we really prioritized. And of course, there's sacrifices and a lot of things there, but because that was a higher priority than those things we let go of, we were able to kind of figure that out. But it takes work for sure. So,
Yeah, I think that it can take a surprising amount of work. So, one thing that we've talked about is being more conscious of the way that you're spending your money. And if you are conscious of the way that you're spending your money, you're then able to make sure that you're spending your money in a way that reflects your values and that it's going towards the things that actually make you happy. So, for example, if I enjoy cooking and I don't really care about trying out new restaurants all the time, even though I just said that I do like to try them sometimes, it probably doesn't make sense for me to spend a quarter of my paycheck on eating out all the time. So if I look at how I'm spending my money and I realize I'm doing that, then, maybe that's money I want to put towards something else. Of course, that's easier said than done because most people don't really know exactly where their money goes. I think that most of us just have a general sense, but we're not tracking our spending in any really reliable way. So, Erin, have you tried tracking your spending? And if so, how did you do it? Did you use an app? Were you doing it by hand? And if you did do it, were you surprised by what you found you were spending money on? Or did you find that the way that you spend money tends to be in line with the things you care about and would want to spend your money on?
yeah, so I actually want to get better at tracking my money. I did at one point for a short time was like pretty consistent about it. What's really nice though is my credit card breaks down costs, which is very
Mm-hmm.
helpful. So it'll give me kind of a pie chart every month of where money went. Great feature. And I've also gotten to the habit of putting everything, like all everyday household expenses, on one card from one bank account so I
Mm-hmm.
can, keep track of kind of where all that money's going. I find it way too hard to keep track of spending when it's from a bunch of different places. One year, I kept track of everything I spent on clothing and was shocked to learn that it was actually right around the average that a typical woman spends on clothing per year, even though I exclusively purchased ethical and sustainable fashion and secondhand clothing. And that was really eye opening for me because I often hear the argument that it's too expensive.
Yeah, I'm actually not surprised to hear that you might spend around the same amount as the average woman spends on clothing per year because I think that so much of what has become popular is to buy a whole bunch of clothing, but it's very cheaply made. And so then, of course, I mean, this is a whole other topic that I'm
Yeah.
sure we'll get into at some point, but then you just keep having to replace your clothing.
Mhm.
Whereas, if you don't do that, then you have more money to put towards other things. And so I think, towards sustainable brands and towards thrifting.
Yeah, it's like fewer, better quality versus a lot.
Exactly. Yeah. So again, that's something that we will get into another time. But I'm actually not too surprised to hear that because I know you're not constantly buying things. So for me, as I said, I did start tracking my spending sort of late last year, I think was when I started. And I remember at the time, I thought that I didn't spend a lot of money on eating food out because I don't like go out for drinks every weekend. I'm not ordering in food all the time or anything like that. But once I started actually tracking all of the things that I was spending money on, I was really shocked and honestly kind of embarrassed by how much money I spent on eating food out, especially considering that I'm someone that likes to cook. And I think something that was very eye opening for me as well about that was that it wasn't that I was spending a lot of money on going to sort of my favorite restaurants, which are smaller restaurants that I like to support and where I really, really love the food and atmosphere. It was a lot of things like, oh, I bought a bagel for $4 at school because I didn't plan enough ahead of time to pack a lunch. Or, just on a whim, I decided to get some tacos with my friend or whatever. But again, once I thought about it, those were things that I could do without and I wouldn't really miss them in my life. And I would much rather that money go towards something else.
I've also been surprised about um, spending money on food and restaurants. It adds
Hmm.
up so fast. And it really, yeah, it really can sneak up on you. And honestly, like, I would like to get a lot better. You've sort of inspired me to get better
Oh,
at doing tracking in more detail because I do. I'd like to have a bit more of that information.
yeah. Well, anytime that you would like to talk about it, I could get you set up with the system that I use. It's probably too intense for most people, but it works for me. And I do think there's simpler versions of it. So, my friend, the one who is very into, tracking spending and being frugal and things like that, he helped me to set up this thing called Spend Tracker. And I think that you can look online like how to set up Spend Tracker in Excel or Google Sheets. And the way it basically works is that oh, I guess it has to be in Google Sheets. The way it basically works is that you set up a Google form and then and you just have a couple of questions on there, like, how much money does the thing cost? And then you set up a list of categories for the different categories within your budget. So for me, it would be things like, you know, rent costs, dogs, because I have two dogs and so I have to spend money on them, groceries, those kinds of things. And then if you want, you can put in an optional category for more detail on it. So if it's from a grocery store, I'll usually say exactly which store it was from because I like to know really where my money is going in terms of the stores. And then you can link it to an Excel sheet. So every time that you enter in one of those purchases, it will just basically, the way you can have it set up is that it will like fill in a budget for you. So there's some work you have to do on the back end, but then once you have it set up, you can just have this thing as like an app sitting on your phone and like you can save it to the sort of main screen of your phone and then it will fill in your budget and you can have it say how much money you have left in different categories and if you want to get more into it you can have it create little pie charts or bar graphs or whatever you find useful. So that's the system that I use.
I think there's also apps too, isn't there? Like there's like you can get apps that do spend tracking.
Yes. So I think for most people, like I did this because I like numbers and I really like to have a lot of data. But I think for most people, if you're not wanting to go to all of that, like you mentioned, Erin, you can look at, like just to start, you can, many credit card apps will show that. So mine does as well. And you can also get apps that will do this for you. And again, that's just about your comfort level and how much detail you want. The reason that I don't use those apps is because it bothered me every time they miscategorized something. So I just wanted to know really, really exactly where it was going. But a really easy first step would be to download one of those apps, and it's going to give you, a good amount of information, even if it's not perfect. So, one thing that I want to bring up, because it's something I've heard people say many times, is that they don't want to change anything about the way they spend money because they just want to enjoy their lives and they don't want to miss out on experiences that they would get by spending money. So, for example, going on expensive vacations or eating at restaurants all the time. Erin, do you experience that feeling at all that by not spending money, sometimes you're missing out on things that you would like to do? And do you think that you would be happier if you did spend more money on things like eating out more often or spending more freely on trips?
So I think this is a very common thing to experience. But I guess the way I like to look at it is there will always be things that you'll miss out on,
Hmm.
especially like if we're looking at social media, if you're walking around a store, whatever it is, like there's always, always, always going to be things that you're like, oh, that'd be so amazing. But, you don't get to have it or you don't get to do it. And I just think constantly thinking about what you don't have is not going to bring any kind of happiness into
Yeah.
your life. It sounds really cheesy, but gratitude exercises like can really help to refocus. And I don't mean like, it doesn't have to be a big dramatic thing, but just essentially acknowledging like, hey, that is really, but it's not something I can have in my life. And instead I've got these other things. And then when it comes to money, like save for the things that you really want. You will always, 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 always see things that, at that moment you want, but really refocusing on the things that you truly want and saving up for those is going to feel a lot better than just thinking about all the things, you're missing out on. And I think about this a lot with travel. Like some people have to go big when they travel. They stay at super nice places, eat at the best restaurants, spend a ton of money to do all the things. And of course, like we see this, Instagram them on Instagram. And while I'm sure they have a great time, I also don't think that I have any less of a great experience taking a more budget-friendly trip, right? I think it's a bit of a trap.
Yeah, I agree. And for me at least, the enjoyment that I get out of spending a lot of money on something or like an experience that costs a lot of money, I guess it's not that I enjoy spending the money, but some of those experiences that cost a lot of money, I find that for me, it doesn't last very long. So, for example, I live in San Diego and there are some really great restaurants here. But I have noticed that when I go to the ones that cost a lot more money, even though the food is really, really great and I do enjoy it while I'm there eating the food, it's kind of like counterbalanced sometimes by this feeling of, wow, I just spent, X amount of money on this meal and it's now over. As opposed to, there's also really great meals that I can have that don't have to be that expensive and that really are just as good and where maybe I feel better about supporting the place. I have a restaurant that I really love here and it's owned by a couple and they're very sweet and the food is really, really good. And even though I know there's some other restaurants that I could go check out, which also might be more expensive, I actually prefer to keep going to this place that is still really good food, but a bit less expensive. And I like supporting them. So, yeah, I feel like again, this is something that I'm sure we'll talk about in a future episode, but there's also the question of how long do you enjoy any of those things?
Mhm.
And that's something that everybody just has to think about for themselves.
Yeah, and I mean, a lot of the things that we spend money on, like you said, like it's very temporary. It's a very quick dopamine boost. And then it might just be something of forget about or don't really even think about. So I think investing in those things, yeah, those like really great experiences, things that you've thought a lot about is just a longer term benefit, I
Hmm.
guess, than hey, I'm gonna, buy this thing because I saw it and liked it or whatever.
Yeah, I agree. And I also feel like you said, especially if you're hanging out on social media or going places where there's a lot of things to buy or where the people around you are spending a lot of money, there's always going to be things that you're going to feel like you want in the moment, even if
Mhm.
long term, maybe that's not really something that you want to be spending your money on. And I think that this can happen with many aspects of life, where in order to understand how you really deeply feel about money, you have to actually sit down and analyze your spending a little bit. So we have talked a lot about, tracking your spending and making sure that your spending reflects your values. But of course, this isn't actually all that simple. It can be difficult for practical reasons, like if you don't have a lot of wiggle room in your finances. But even if you do, it's actually something that requires a lot of thought and can be pretty tiring. And I think for a lot of people, it can also cause anxiety. So when I've been talking to people about the idea of tracking their spending, I've had a lot of them tell me that they are afraid to find out how they spend money. Like they
Mhm.
don't really want to know how they spend their money because they're going to feel bad when they find out. And even once you understand where you're spending your money, it's actually a pretty big change to start to spend your money differently. So I'm curious, was there a point when you realized that you needed to change how you were spending money, or were you taught pretty strong money skills growing up? And do you have any advice or tips you would want to give in terms of what's been helpful for you?
Yeah, so I agree. It can be really intimidating. And I think there, like with many things, there's a bit of that like ignorance is bliss attitude about it. I was thankfully raised with very good financial literacy. I was taught from a pretty young age to be extremely careful with debt, and especially how credit card debt compounds, and how you end up paying a ridiculous amount of money to the bank. So saving, keeping track of what's in my bank account, avoiding debt unless it's for like a major investment like school or mortgage has always been something very much on my mind, which I'm very grateful for. I know there's a lot of people that don't have that. For advice, I think setting a budget for things is super helpful, just so that this is the maximum amount of money I can spend on, whatever this thing is. And then it forces you to figure out ways to stay in that budget. So for just saving money, shopping secondhand first for almost everything has saved us so much money. Like I don't have the numbers to quantify it, but just, I've been shopping secondhand. And I mean like secondhand for everything, like household
Hmm.
goods, I've been doing that for like over 10 years. And so I'm sure over the years, it's been a lot of money that we've saved. I love secondhand buy sell sites, secondhand options. It is a great way to save money.
Yeah, I agree. I also try to buy most things secondhand. And initially, that was something that I did. Well, with clothing, I really just enjoyed it. And I used to live in Montreal, and there were amazing secondhand clothing stores that I
Mhm.
could go to. I don't quite feel like I have that same luxury in San Diego. But yeah, there's a lot of reasons that I love secondhand clothes shopping as well. And I mean, secondhand shopping for everything. And a big part of it is that, yeah, it just costs way less money. And sometimes you can find nicer things than you would normally be able to afford. So why would
Totally.
I not do it? There's also so many great apps and sites
Mhm.
for anything that you want to look for secondhand at this point. So it's become very easy recently.
And there's, of course, huge sustainability benefits.
Yes. Yeah, of course. Of course. Maybe we should probably have a whole episode on like
Oh,
secondhand
yes.
shopping at some point. Um, so I think you were very lucky that you just grew up
Mhm.
being taught about, being taught financial literacy. My mom is great with these things, but for various reasons, it wasn't something that I grew up being very good with. And it's something that I've had to put a lot of energy into as an adult, which is probably why I was so surprised by how much money I was spending, buying bagels and coffee and things like that. Um, so, one thing that I have found that has been really useful, like a big mental switch that I've made, is the way that I do grocery shopping. So, I think the way that a lot of people are doing grocery shopping and the way that I always did until maybe the last year or so was that I would just wait until I felt like I had to go, and then I would go to the store and buy kind of whatever I felt like for dinner that day or whatever appealed to me to buy that week. And I mean, I still, if there's something I need for dinner, obviously I'm going to go buy it. But I have changed a lot to buying for the future and like shopping sales. And I don't mean buying things that are on sale because I see that they're on sale and then I decide to get them, but specifically buying things that I know I use all the time. So, for example, I make a lot of marinara sauce because I love pasta. And one time I found the really nice cans of diced tomatoes for 50 cents each at this discount grocery store that I go to. So I bought like 20 of them because that is actually something that I will use a lot of. And normally they're almost $5 each. So that idea of putting more thought into it again, of what are the types of things that I know I buy all the time. And now if I see that somewhere on sale, I can, invest a little bit more money now if I'm able to and buy a bunch of that thing instead of just thinking, what do I want to eat today? And then buying that, even if it leaves me with a bunch of leftovers that I don't really want. Yeah, I've just found that it's much less expensive to grocery shop if you put some thought into understanding the things that you use all the time and not just buying whatever you feel like every time you go to the grocery store.
Yeah, so what you're really hitting on is like that idea of planning, and planning can be, like you said, like planning for, future meals coming up, and planning can also be like much longer term in the sense of, what sort of housing situation do I want to like work towards? What
Hmm.
sort of like even, around things like what kind of jobs would I want that maybe allow certain whatever aspects of my life, but more than that too, like planning for those major things that you want out of life that require some budgeting and planning. And what I want to hit on around planning is that I think at first it can feel like a lot of work
Hmm.
because you're sitting down and thinking, oh gosh, I need to track and I need to sort out what I want and I need to, do a bit of soul searching to figure out like what I actually want in my life. But what I wanted to mention is once you start doing some of that, it becomes habit.
Yes.
So you have to put in a bit of initial work, but then down the line, it just is something that, you just do. And it doesn't feel like it requires extra work.
Yeah, I would say that initially I put a fair amount, especially because I did a really intense
Right.
form of budgeting. So I initially put a lot of work into that. But again, it was because I enjoy doing that kind of thing. I like working with data. So you don't have to feel like you need to do that. There are apps again. But it did very quickly just become the way that I live my life. And it actually became something I really enjoyed. Like, ooh, I'll go to the store today and like, now I'm thinking strategically, which for me is something that's actually fun. Like I enjoy that planning aspect. And it also, I think, has made me happier in other ways and worked with some of my morals in other ways as well. Like, for example, with grocery shopping and planning out how you grocery shop and what types of things you actually like to eat a lot, as opposed to just buying whatever you feel like all the time. It also works with this value that I have of not wanting to waste food, right? I think a
Hmm.
lot of us don't want to waste food, but we end up doing it all the time because we just haven't put that planning into figuring out, how we shop and what things are actually going to get used up. Or also doing things like looking in your fridge every day or every other day or however often you need to and seeing what needs to get used up soon, or even figuring out a system of where to put the food, like certain types of food that are going to need to get used up faster.
Hmm.
So there was actually a hack that I saw on TikTok. That was if you like, I think something that happens to a lot of people is you forget your fruits and vegetables in the drawers and then they just rot. So my partner and I started putting our produce in the doors of the fridge.
Okay.
And then you put it was actually an ADHD hack, okay? Um, because then you're looking at it all the time. And when we
Hmm.
do that, we actually use it up. So, anyway, having some kind of system that helps you to reduce food waste, not only does that work with my morals in terms of, I don't want to be throwing food in the garbage all the time, but it actually also saves money. So, I think that a lot of these things can work together once you start to put a little bit more planning into how you're spending your money. It has effects on other areas of your life, and it all kind of works together, or at least for me, it has worked together to make me overall feel better about how I'm spending my money and being better at saving my money for what I actually care about.
Hmm.
So I feel like there are a ton of things that we could say about money and spending, and I'm sure that we'll revisit this topic. Um, but maybe just to wrap things up for now, so that we don't go on forever about this, Erin, do you have any final thoughts on spending or money or budgeting?
Yeah, I agree. I think there's so much we can talk about around money. Yeah, I guess when it comes to thinking about where your money is going, I think it's also really helpful to make a mental note of things that you really regret having spent money on to learn from that mistake so that you don't make it again. I definitely see and know people who are constantly making impulse purchases and then regretting their purchases. And it's a very easy cycle to get stuck in because we know that spending money gives us a dopamine hit. So, practicing acknowledging that and then trying to shift to a more logical position, such as asking yourself, like, do I truly want this? Am I going to use it? That type of thing can really help with avoiding wasting money on things that don't add any value to your life. And also, it can be really rewarding to save up for something that you really want.
Yeah, I completely agree. And actually, that is a great piece of advice that I have never thought of, like making a list of shopping regrets, because I think this happens to most of us that if you haven't really put time into thinking about this, that you buy things and then, you think you're going to love them or you feel really excited about them. And then a week or a month later, it's just like another piece of garbage in your
Mhm.
home that you now have to deal with, which is terrible. Of course, there's, many reasons that you don't want to be doing that. And or at least for me, there's many reasons I don't want to be doing that. And it also just wastes a lot of your money on things that you maybe don't really care about. So maybe a good thought to leave off with is that we'd like to remind everyone to take some time to think about how you spend your own money and whether it reflects your values, And not only the things that make you happy, but also the lifestyle you want to build. So, that idea of what you want for your life overall and longer term happiness. A great place to start, if you're not doing it already, is to track your spending for maybe a month and see if you're surprised by what you find and whether or not you're happy with how you spend your money. This can be a great way to help declutter your life by focusing your money and therefore your time on the things that really matter to you. So, thank you for tuning into our podcast In Search of Slow and joining us on this exploration of slow living and trying to find some breathing room in a chaotic world.